A monster exists among us. It haunts the desolate, lonely regions, lingering in the shadows and the secret places of the twilight forest. It is fixed into the realm of primordial nightmares and dwells always within the midnight dimensions of our deepest fears. Blackwater Media presents Dogman Terror Anthology 2. Back in September of 2019, I had an encounter with a Dogman. Since then, I've done a lot of reading about these creatures, and the more I learned, the more I became sure that I was lucky to get out of that experience alive. It was early doe season in Michigan. My cousin wanted to go out on a hunting trip, and I decided to go out with him. He headed to the west side of the property, and I went to the east side. I went through our woods, then cut into the neighbor's property, who had given us permission to hunt there, and headed to the tree stand. Once I got close to the patch of woods behind the field, I felt a dark presence, but really didn't think much of it because it was still dark. Looking back on it, I should have gotten my ass out of there at that moment. Anyway, I took 2 steps into the patch of woods when I heard the deepest growl I've ever heard in my life. It's the kind of growl that vibrates all the way through you. I looked up to where the sound came from and saw 2 glowing eyes about 15 yards away from me and looking dead at me. I took the safety off my rifle. At that moment, the eyes instantly elevated, and I could see that the thing was standing. The only way I can describe this thing is as a gigantic wolf standing up like a man. It was easily 7 feet tall, completely black, and had tall pointed ears. It had a muscular torso that narrowed down to a slimmer waist. I remember thinking to myself, what the fuck do I do now? The creature turned and was gone in 2 running leaps. I reluctantly went to the tree stand to see if I could get another look at the thing, and all the while hoping it wouldn't come back. Thank God it never did. I used to enjoy hunting, but goddamn it all now. I don't like having to wonder whether I'm the hunter or the prey. If you look at a map of the state of Georgia, you'll see that the St. Mary's River forms the southernmost border of the state. When you cross the river at that point, you're into Florida. I enjoy fishing at the northwestern stretch of the river, near the town of Folkestone. There's lots of little streams and creeks where you can fish for bluegill, crappie, and even bass. I usually park my truck just a few yards from the bank, whip out my cooler, tackle box, folding chair, radio, and enjoy a few hours of fishing and relaxation. One particular Saturday in May of 2018, I'd gone down to one of my favorite little spots with the idea of catching enough for a nice fish fry with extra to go into the freezer for the following weekend. I usually did the basic thing, flour them down and toss them into a cast iron skillet and enjoy them with some coleslaw and home fries. Anyway, I did end up with a decent catch, enough for my plans anyway, and I'd gotten everything broken down and back onto the truck by about 7:30 that evening. As I pulled back onto the highway, I took notice of how fantastic the early stages of sunset was on the river. I'd easily be home by dark. Now, I'd barely gotten a mile down the highway when I happened to glance over to my left. About 20 yards off the highway, there was a marshy area with high reeds. My eyes happened to catch movement down by the edge of the water. At first, I thought maybe a deer or maybe even a bear might have come down to the water's edge to drink. I slowed down a little bit to see if I could get a better look, and then decided to just go ahead and pull off to the side of the road. If I was lucky, I wouldn't scare it off. So I stepped out of the truck, and the minute I did, I knew that I'd made a huge mistake. At that moment, this thing rose up out of the grass, and when it did, I heard what sounded like bone snapping. I can remember quietly mouthing the words, "What the fuck is that thing?" It looked like a giant black wolf, except that it was standing on two goddamn legs. Now, when I say giant, I mean that from the distance away that I was, I could tell that this creature was about 8 feet tall. I was frozen in place. I saw it sniff the air, and then it turned and looked right at me. I could see it had crazy orange eyes, and it squinted its eyes, then let out a deep growl and took a few steps in my direction. Now that's all it took to snap me out of my trance, because I jumped my ass back into the truck and tore off down the highway. All the way home, my hands gripped the wheel like a vice, and I was sweating like a racehorse. Every so often, I glanced into the rearview mirror just to be sure that it wasn't chasing after me. I kept glancing back until I'd gotten 2 or 3 miles from home. Once I got home, I dipped deep into the whiskey. Now, like I said before, that had been one of my favorite areas for fishing. And I haven't been back there since. And I damn sure never will go back again. I've never talked about this before. It's something that I saw about 5 years ago. There have been instances since that time that I considered telling someone but could never work up the courage. I just assumed that people would think I was either crazy, delusional, or just making it up. But I decided it was more important to share this experience, to let people know that these kinds of things are real. And I thought maybe someone else has had a similar experience. Somehow it's comforting to know that somewhere out there are others who can relate to what happened to me. So like I said, it was about 5 years ago. I've always been kind of a night owl and was up late every night watching TV, reading, or listening to music. It wasn't uncommon for me to, at least once or twice a week, fall asleep in my chair in the den. If I remember correctly, it was a Thursday night, Friday morning, and I must have dozed off in the chair maybe around 2 or 2:30. Anyway, I woke up about an hour later. The TV was still on, but the volume was down to a minimum. I looked at my watch and saw that it was 3:17. Then a strange sensation came over me. For whatever reason, a powerful feeling of fear washed over me like a damn tidal wave. And that's when I glanced out the window. Now let me tell you, What I saw out in my front yard was the most horrifying thing you can imagine, and way beyond any nightmare I've ever had. Standing there looking directly back at me was the biggest wolf I've ever seen. I mean, this damn thing was easily bigger than a horse. It was long and shaggy, and it just stood there motionless, glaring at me with eyes that were hot yellow. What I saw in those eyes was pure hatred and absolute malevolence. I turned my head, pretending not to look, but cut my eyes to the right so I could still see it. After another minute or two, the creature raised its snout and sniffed up in the air. Then it started to slowly walk off to the left. I watched it until it disappeared into the darkness. I sat there for the rest of the morning, probably in a state of shock. I remember eventually getting up to make some coffee, and I even dropped off on a short nap later on in the afternoon. I spent the next few days trying to figure out what the hell that wolf thing was and why it stood out there staring at me. To this day, I still can't answer those questions. But I can tell you this. When the sun goes down, beware of things that walk the night. I'm currently a resident of Altoona, Pennsylvania. I wanted to share a strange encounter I experienced with a friend of mine in the early morning hours of Sunday, March 17th of 2013. I've chosen up till now not to talk about this event due to an unwillingness to expose myself or my family and friends to public scrutiny. In light of a recent spate of similar sightings in central Pennsylvania, I've changed my mind. Perhaps our experience will help with the current research. As such, I'd like to make my intention clear that myself and any persons mentioned be able to retain anonymity at this time. You see, reporting a Bigfoot or even a UFO sighting is one thing, but this is something entirely different. On the evening in question, a friend and I were returning from a job in Williamsburg. My friend was driving. To the best of my recollection, the incident occurred somewhere between 1:30 a.m. and 2 a.m. on the morning of March 17th. Although spring was only a few days away, there was still some snow on the ground. We were traveling southwest on Route 22 through a rural suburb of Hollidaysburg, Pennsylvania. As we rounded a little curve in the road, our attention was drawn to our left on the opposite side of the road. Standing or semi-squatting in a clearing a few feet off the side of the road was some kind of creature. Now, my friend wasn't driving very fast and slowed a bit as we approached. Our initial view of it was from its dorsal side as it was facing away from us. It came into profile as we passed with its right side to us. It struck me immediately that the creature had a combination of both human and canine features. It was squatting down on its legs close to the ground, but was doing so in a bipedal fashion. The legs had the stifle joint of a hawk, characteristic of a canine, not like a human leg. It had its front limbs or arms in front of it, and I believe it was possibly crouched over something, maybe a smaller animal it had killed. Now, this thing's arms were long in proportion to its body. I recall thinking the hands were more human-like as opposed to paws. Its torso seemed to be somewhat hunched forward. I had the impression that at any moment it could have gone to all fours quite comfortably. The creature's chest was not broad like a human's, but had a pronounced forward angled breastbone like a canid. It gave the impression of great strength, having distinct and well-defined musculature, but was not built on a massive frame. It seemed more thin and sinewy. If it had stood fully erect, I would estimate that the creature would have been close to 7 feet tall. It was covered in fur that was grayish silver in color. The creature seemed unnaturally shiny, although this could have been a reflection from the headlights or the moon. It had pointy, erect canine ears that were somewhat laid back on its head. The head was large and very wolf-like overall in appearance. The muzzle was also very wolf-like, although the snout wasn't exceptionally elongated. It had canine teeth, though. To the best of my recollection, the eyes were an amberish color, but again, that may have been the reddish glow reflection to them. It had a wolf-like tail. It turned its head to watch us and tracked us as we passed. It seemed quite aware of our presence, and it let out a chilling howl that filled the night air. My friend and I continued in stunned silence for a few moments. When the creature was no longer in view, I turned and asked my friend what we'd just seen. His exact words were, "We just saw a fucking werewolf." I agreed that that's pretty much my own assessment. I asked if he'd turn the car around, but he absolutely refused to do so. It's probably just as well. We spent the rest of the trip debating as to whether it could have been a dog or even someone's escaped pet wolf, but to be honest, it just wasn't. I'm sure of that. Both my friend and I are experienced outdoorsmen, and neither one of us has ever seen anything fitting that description before. I was actually raised not far from the area and know it quite well. I've spoken to my friends about this, and we'd both be willing to take a polygraph concerning this incident. Since that time, I've learned that what we saw that night is what people call Dogman. There's a lot being said about these creatures on the internet over the last few years. A lot of interesting stuff, and a lot of deep, steamy bullshit. But I can tell you one damn thing for sure. These creatures exist. There's an experience that I want to share with you. Something that I remember that happened to my friend and I in our hometown in Florida. Where my friend lived, there was a patch of woods that went about 5 miles until it hit the town. Well, all I know is when we were about 8, I managed to convince him to go into the woods as soon as his father left for work because we weren't actually supposed to. So, as boys will, we hopped over the fence that cut off the woods at his house. At first, we had a blast exploring the woods because it was only about 6 and still light out, and we walked around goofing off and acting all big and bad. But then, we came across this mound of dirt, and it was a dirty t-shirt and a shoe and a stained blanket next to it. A little weird, but that was fine, and we didn't make much of it because, I don't know, we were innocent and stupid, and laughed at the thought of someone running around naked out there way back when. So we walked on and came across another pile, except this time it was made of rocks and was like a cave, like you'd think of for a wolf or a cougar's den. There was an old bicycle laying on the ground outside of it. I wanted to explore it. I don't know why. I think I thought I might find treasure or something, but he convinced me it was time to go back. I agreed because it was getting darker, and we damn sure didn't want his dad to catch us. Well, when you exit the woods, at least back then, there's a strip of cleared land, and we heard this gnawing or chewing noise or something. So we turned and we saw what we both instantly knew came out of that cave. Holy shit. This had to be the biggest wolf imaginable. But I remember my friend and I looking at each other like, wait a minute, there's no fucking wolves in Florida. But there it was. It hunched over a deer eating it. We could hear it chomping under a low growl. For some reason, we watched it even though we were scared shitless. It hadn't seemed to notice us yet. Then, of course, right on cue, it lifted its head. That was it. We took off, tearing ass, scrambling over the fence, and hid out at my friend's house. His brother came back first, and we told him about the clothes in the cave, but not about the thing we saw. It's been more than 20 years since that happened, and we still haven't gone back into those woods. Over the years, I can remember trying to convince myself that it didn't happen, that my memory was somehow playing tricks on me. But that was just me, bullshitting myself, trying to talk myself out of what I know was real and what I know to be true. My friend and I encountered a Dogman that day, and if it really wanted to get us, it would have been easy. That realization and the memory of what happened have made this incident the most frightening and horrific experience of my life. You're listening to the Blackwater Media Radio Network, the finest in digital audio entertainment. This is Blackwater Media coming to you from the great city of Atlanta. One of the earliest accounts of a Dogman encounter in the United States goes back to the last 2 decades of the 1800s, out in what was known then as the Arizona Territory. Now, of course, when you mention the American Southwest in relation to this, some people automatically think of Native Americans, the Navajo in particular, which leads to the inevitable conversation about skinwalkers. But this story has nothing to do with skinwalkers or shape-shifting or any of the other subjects that sometimes get dragged down into the Dogman discussion. Now, some of you have heard about some of the things that went down in Tombstone, Arizona. That's right. What I want to tell you about happened around the time that Wyatt Earp, Bat Masterson, and Doc Holliday were establishing themselves as permanent historical fixtures of what we now call the Old West. But it was another man, a man named William Arnett, now largely obscured by time, who was engaged in exploits no less exciting. Arnett was a Texan and was known to have done a stint as a ranger. But he had, over a period of time, worked as an Army scout, bounty hunter, and was known to be an expert tracker. It was this reputation that brought him to the Arizona Territory, Cochise County to be precise. You see, between Nugent's Pass and Bisbee, there were more than 24 ranches that had been experiencing what at the time was being called strange goings-on. This included sheep, chickens, and cattle being attacked in the middle of the night and eaten, in whole or in part. Of course, this was initially attributed to coyotes, but the severity of the mutilation suggested a larger predator, a much larger predator. But more than that, there were even reports of a strange creature skulking around the outskirts of many of these ranches, just as dusk fell. It was described as a wolf as big as a buffalo, a wolf that could stand up on 2 legs and walk like a man. Now, the men who were able to catch a glimpse of the creature were only ever able to get off a few random shots at it until it scrambled out of sight. The last ranch to be struck was the Gadsden Place near Packard, just west of Bisbee. The scene was the same as all the rest. Cattle gutted, ripped, mutilated, and half-eaten. The ranch foreman, a man named Russell, described his discovery as blood and guts scattered out over 1.5 acres of the property. After that, several of the largest ranch owners met and agreed to bring Arnett in. He was, they figured, their best hope. Besides, how much longer would it be before whatever it was turned its attention to people? William Arnett, having received the urgent telegram, replied, gathered the necessary supplies, and headed south. Upon his arrival, Arnett met with a group of the larger ranch owners, with Benton Gatson at the lead. The ranchers brought him up to speed on exactly what had been taking place, including dates, times, weather conditions, and so forth. They all knew that by reputation, Arnett was a quick study and in short order would be out and after the monster wolf. Gatson provided Arnett with lodgings, and that first night, several of the men dined at his table. You see, Gatson had started the ranch after coming out west from Ohio after the surrender of General Lee. Since then, he built it up to one of the largest ranches in the territory. He was an honest and well-respected man, and when something troubled and upset him, it was troubling and upsetting for everyone, especially the other ranchers. The next 2 days and nights were uneventful, at least according to Arnett. He spent most of that time out scouting around the area, including the locations of reported sightings of the creature. It was said that at the time he didn't talk much, just a nod and an occasional word in morning or evening greeting, but was seen regularly writing in what looked to be a leather-bound journal. Nobody at that time, nor for years, decades after, had the faintest idea about the contents of the pages within. The sun rose and shone brightly on the third day, and things seemed very much as they had been on the previous 2 days. Arnett was out and about, having been seen at various points by the ranch hands along Rattlesnake Pass, Whitby Spring, Corbin's Trail, and others. However, later on, as the sun set beneath the distant hills, all hell broke loose. It started with barking dogs kicking up a ruckus and the sound of a horse, most assumed to be Arnett, tearing ass through a meadow. Then, somewhere out in the darkness, a terrible howl. Behind that was the distinctive sound of Arnett Sharp's 1874 rifle. The night air began to fill with the anger and fury of the chase and the hunt. Some of the men, the ranch hands, peered out in the night from lantern-lit windows, the yellowish-orange haze being visible at a distance. Others, with a few more grains of courage, had taken lanterns out to the perimeter fences, thinking they might see something of the action. What would later be known as the general melee seemed to go on and on through the night, but in truth, it was probably no more than about 20 minutes. The air was choked with the smell of oil and smoke, dust, wood, and leather. Finally, things fell silent. Then the men could hear the sound of what must have been Arnett coming back across the meadow on horseback. They started gathering around as he rode up. "The thing is done," Arnett said. "Come and see." The men scrambled out behind Arnett's horse, back down to the meadow with the amber glow of more than a dozen lanterns leading the way. Further down, in the midst of the high grass, they saw a monstrous form lying dead on the ground. It seemed as though the rumors were true. A wolf, big as a buffalo, black as midnight, that could walk on 2 legs. Even in the darkness, the men could see the different points at which Arnett's shots had successfully struck home. Then Arnett looked at the men, gave a slight nod, and rode off. No one rightly knows what the bounty was on the creature. Some say $5,000 or $10,000. Hell, there were reports in the tombstone epitaph that it was as high as $25,000. All I can report with certainty is that at least half of his bounty was paid in gold. Reports and sightings of Arnett get kind of sketchy after that. A lot of rumors and whispering was swirled up into folklore. Stories about some weird lizard thing he took out after down in Louisiana Bayou country. There was some other yarn about him mixing it up with a Navajo shaman and a handful of others, including a run-in with the Ku Klux Klan in Georgia. But those have to wait for another time. Suffice it to say, William Arnett is a true hero of what we now call the Old West, although his exploits, as I said, carried him to nearly all points of the compass. And as we know now, that included going head-to-head with a ravenous, vicious Dogman.
In Washington, ghost-like objects dart across the radar screen at the CAA Traffic Control Center at National Airport for several hours, traveling more than 100 miles an hour. Air Force jet fighters spend several hours chasing the objects plotted on the radar scope.
Something else is out there.
There's something else out there, okay.
Of all the banks and braes of bonny Scotland, none holds more fascination than the murky waters of Loch Ness.
Tell me, do you think there is life on other planets?
Well, I'm not quite sure, but I suppose there would be.
No, he seems definite. You seem
Definitely.
definite. How do you see this life and where?
Oh, I've seen a flying saucer.
My name is Roger. When I was a teenager, my friends and I would hang out on the Gunnison River, not far from its confluence with the Uncompahgre River near my hometown of Delta, Colorado. One late night in the mid-90s, I'd arranged to meet a friend at our preferred spot along the Gunnison River. It was about midnight. We had a routine of exploring an old abandoned factory that still had lights working around it. These lights would illuminate the river and shoreline. The river at this location was fairly shallow during the summer and could be easily crossed. While I was waiting, I decided to kill some time. There was an auto parts lot / junkyard near the location that I wanted to check out and explore. It's still there, by the way. I was always fascinated with automobiles, and it turned into a pretty good career as an auto mechanic. I actually knew the man who owned the lot, which was guarded by a German Shepherd that was very friendly with me. In fact, there were times when the dog would wander down to the river in order to greet me. Now, as I made my way towards the lot, I had to pass a huge downed tree that laid along the river shore. The end of the downed tree had a large bundle of exposed roots and debris from the river. As I walked by the tree, I noticed a pair of long ears visible from the other side on top of the downed tree. I thought that the German Shepherd came down to greet me as usual, so I started calling out to him. In fact, I tossed a few pebbles in that direction in order to get his attention. That was a mistake. And I mean a big goddamn mistake. All of a sudden, an unimaginable creature stood up. The light from the abandoned factory gave me a clear view of this thing. What I saw was a 7 to 8 foot tall humanoid with the head of a large wolf. The canine teeth were clearly visible, and its orange-yellow eyes looked directly at me. What was crazy about the eyes was that they looked like distant lights coming from a tunnel. That scared the shit out of me. I was so horrified, I literally put my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming in terror. The creature reacted by grabbing the exposed roots and leaping on top of the downed tree. I got an even better look at it then. This was clearly a sparsely haired bipedal canine with a wide muscular chest and human-like arms ending in human-like hands and long fingers with talons. The waist and hips were narrow with muscular hocked legs extending down to long human-like feet. It also seemed like it was standing on the balls of its feet. Almost instinctively, I took off running towards the river and quickly waded across it to a chain-link fence, all the time hoping like hell that the thing wouldn't follow. As I looked back, I could see the creature was on all fours watching me from the far shore of the river. Then I noticed that the wolf thing directed its attention upriver. It suddenly took off running on all fours at an incredible speed. Later on, I was told by the man who owned the auto parts lot that I should never walk near the river at night. His comments were, "There are many things out there that we can't comprehend." He was also told by a shaman, an elder of his family's tribe, that I had encountered a spirit of the forest since it didn't attack me. Now, I don't know about any of that, but I know one thing for damn sure. This Dogman creature is no joke, and since then, I've never been back down by the river at night. Dear Dr. Lester, I've heard you relate a number of other people's encounters with Dogman, so I wanted to share this story with you. I was out with my 2 brothers and my dad fishing late at night. I was about 12 or 13 at the time. My brother William was older and Jason was younger. We were on a bridge that stood over a large body of water. I was honestly becoming a bit bored since we'd been fishing for the past hour. The only real exciting thing that happened was when my dad hooked a skate. It was a kick watching him struggle to maintain the pole. He let out a mean stream of curses when his line snapped, signaling his loss in the battle. I remember him saying, "I lost that goddamn son of a bitch." Now, this particular area was surrounded by forests and was beautifully lit up by the night sky. I would look over the bridge's wall countless times just to see the moon's light reflecting off the dark, steady water. The bridge wasn't made of wood but concrete, and it was strange looking now that I think back on it. Instead of being only about 3 feet off the surface of the water, it was maybe 10 or 15. I assumed that it was made for walking or riding across. It was narrow, but just wide enough to fit 3 average people side by side. So like I said, we weren't having that much fun. William led Jason and I down to a large blackberry bush. It was set just next to the beginning of the bridge so my dad could still see us. With our group we had 4 dogs. It seems like a lot, I know, but we currently still have only 2 of our dogs. Tragedies happen, I suppose. Now 2 of the dogs were German Shepherds, which by the way are still the 2 that we have currently. Other than them, we had a border collie and a foxhound Akita mix. Very beautiful dog. Tall and slender, but with just the right amount of muscle. Fast as hell, too. So keep up with me on this because it might get confusing, but it's totally necessary. The female German Shepherd was Charlie. The male German Shepherd was Simon. The foxhound mix was Buddy. And the border collie was Sophie. Okay, so we got that down. Now back to the situation. We weren't really collecting berries. It was more of a pick and eat thing. Every now and then one of us would shout out, startled by the sudden prick of the finger on a thorn. Charlie and Buddy were my personal dogs, leaving Jason and Sophie and my dad with Simon. Now as I was feeling around for berries with Charlie sitting at my side, Jason left to take some berries to my dad. Before I could turn back around to face the bush, something caught my eye. Something big. Now my first thought was that it was a tree. That is, until it turned its head towards me. It locked eyes with me. I felt paralyzed by fear. I barely managed to wave my arm around in William's general direction, trying to catch his attention. He must have noticed as he responded with a quiet, "Yeah." Turning to see what I was looking at, he began to say something, but immediately stopped. All emotion drained from his pale face. "Who is that?" he asked me. I could only mumble, "What?" Not that I didn't hear him. I was correcting him. This thing was massive. Its hair was a wild mix of brown and gray. I could see his eyes, and I thought to myself, oh fuck. They were wide, human-like. From where I stood, they almost looked orange. The rest was basically a silhouette. I could feel the presence of the dogs next to us. Charlie snarled, stalking closer bit by bit. I wanted to jump at her, do anything to keep her away from it. Simon was staring intently, as was Buddy, but kept his position in front of William and me. This thing was standing on its hind legs, but looked like a big dog, at least something with long pointed ears. It had long fingers, or more than likely, claws. It leaned forward a bit, but not much, almost as if it wanted to intensify its glare or maybe just get a better look at us. I jumped at the sound of Charlie snapping her jaws at the thing before bounding towards it. I nearly choked on my breath as Buddy followed her. I frantically looked around for Simon, who was cowering behind William with his head bowed down, growling. William started to run after them. And to be honest, I started to cry from both fear and slight anger. I heaved a breath and willed my legs to run as fast as I could. Now, William was on the track team and played baseball, but he was the very least of my worries because I was too. It was the fact that we were chasing two dogs and a terrifying wolf creature. Now that I think back on what I did, I must have been insane. Nevertheless, I chased them in the woods, and we eventually slowed to a stop as we saw the dogs ahead of us. They were standing defensively, barking and snarling at the wolf thing. It dropped down on four legs. The dogs fell back as though they'd been pushed and scurried away from it as an ear-piercing scream sounded. Buddy took off back to the bridge where we later found him, and Charlie crouched in front of William and I. The scream sound strangled unlike anything I'd ever heard. I'd let out a fearful shout before I felt something grab hold of my wrist, which, believe me, did not help my situation. William was trying to pull me along, trying to get us the hell out of there. All three of us ran towards the bridge. The whole way there, it felt as though the creature was right on my heels, me being in the back by maybe a foot. Once we were free from the trees, we did not stop. We bolted into the water. William and I, Charlie, merely followed, not knowing what the hell to do. I whipped my head around as we stopped and saw nothing but pine trees. I choked on my tears, feeling both relieved and terrified of what had just gone down. Back on the bridge, we told our dad. He called it bullshit, that we were just playing a prank. "But you heard the scream, right?" we'd ask him. He would blow us off completely and continue fishing. He was, and still is, a skeptic. Gotta see it to believe it. That was his motto when it comes to the paranormal. Now, I honestly don't know what that thing was, and I don't think I want to. Of course, part of me is curious, but all of me wants to know what I'm dealing with so I have more information on the subject. I know for a fact that many other people have had similar experiences. And based on all the stories that I've heard or read about, I'm pretty sure that what we encountered that night was a Dogman. Back around 20 years ago, I was visiting my great uncle in the region around Fredericksburg, Texas. And at the time, he was living in his first house in the area before he moved into a retirement community near a small set of trees. The trees were really beautiful, as it was in the hill country. I was staying with him and my great aunt for about a week when we went out for an evening to walk his dog, as we tended to do in the evenings in general. The walk was largely uneventful as the sun set, just a normal evening complete with the call of doves and other wildlife, and the dog was just having a wonderful time. Then, suddenly, all the wildlife went instantly silent, and both of us froze, as did the dog. I remember a feeling of distinct unease and fear growing in me, and I couldn't explain why. And the dog was looking directly in a specific area near a streetlight. I trained my eyes in that direction. I was shocked to see a creature loping through there. It was the beginning of an absolute surreal experience. The thing was something I first took to be a large dog, but it took only a split second to realize that this creature was far, far too large. Running on 4 legs, this thing was easily 4 feet at the shoulder and moved with a kind of motion that I'd never seen before. It looked hypnotic in a sense, and I was more terrified than I'd ever been with anything else I'd ever seen. I can't stress enough the true feelings of dread and horror that swept over me. And it was a visceral fear, as if we'd been thrust into some dark corner of H.P. Lovecraft's imagination. Now let me tell you something. Whatever this goddamn thing was, it looked like the biggest German Shepherd ever born times 5. And I couldn't help but notice its eyes too. They were fucking huge. And aside from having a weird orange amber tint to them, they seemed to project an intent of total malice. The thing was powerfully built too. The upper limbs in particular were very well developed and easily seen beneath the dark fur. And again, the fear. Like I said before, it was a feeling as if I was being forced to experience every nightmare that I'd ever had. And then it got worse. The creature slowed its pace slightly and then came to a complete stop. It looked to the right and seemed to sniff the air. Then it raised itself up and stood on 2 legs. That's right. This gigantic monster wolf death machine stood up on 2 legs and darted off at a speed I can't even begin to describe, and it disappeared into the darkness. Now, like I said, at the time, I had no idea what this thing really was. But since then, I've learned that it was known as a Dogman. I've read online that a few skeptics say that something like a Dogman can't exist because the anatomy of a bipedal canine just doesn't work. Pure asinine bullshit. Zoology 101 class logic just doesn't apply here. Save that for Animal Planet. These creatures exist. I have no idea what they really are, where they come from, what their place is in the big scheme of things, or anything else for that matter. But I can tell you one thing for damn sure. It would be better for you to accept the reality of these things based on the encounters that you've heard or read about than for you to learn of the horror the way I did. You see, this creature, in just the span of a few minutes, was able to instill within me the bleakest, darkest landscape of terror. Within this monster, I discovered all the elements of fear. About 10 years ago, a close friend of mine named Tyler was a deputy in a small town in Michigan. He came over one evening and told me he had something to show me. Being the curious type, I was immediately interested in whatever it was and said, okay. We went about 5 miles up the highway and then he took a turn down this old dirt road. After going another mile or so, we came upon a weekender's cabin. It was actually very nice and included a spacious loft. We got out and he led me around the outside of the house and showed me where something had attacked the cabin. The aluminum screen doors had puncture holes where something had bitten straight through them. There were puncture holes all around the door frames, and pieces of wood were laying on the ground where they'd been torn off the frames. The wood panels of one of the other doors had been splintered and cracked as if something had pounded on them with incredible force. In the back, there was a huge picture window. It wasn't broken or even cracked, but what looked like saliva and blood were dripping down the window. Considering the position of the window, whatever attacked that cabin had to have stood about 7 feet tall. But there was more. He pointed out that all around the perimeter of the cabin, there were tracks. The ground there was fairly soft, and so anything with appreciable weight would leave prints. But these looked like huge paw prints. Now, by huge, I mean in comparison to the local wildlife. Black bear, foxes, coyotes, even bobcats. And these tracks were clearly padded, dog-type prints, but were at least 6 to 8 inches across. That's when he told me about reports of people seeing a strange creature that was called a Dogman. He said that the thing basically was a huge, wolf-like creature that could stand up and walk on 2 legs. Now I have to tell you, if I'd been hearing this from anybody else, I would have suggested that they re-up their medication. But Tyler was a rock-solid, straightforward, no bullshit type guy. He was very well liked and respected by everybody. The reports that he knew about came from a pair of hunters and a man named Benton who owned a local garage and auto parts shop. That's what got him to thinking about the cabin. See, Tyler knew the family that owned it. They would come out from Detroit once or twice a year and stay in it for a few weeks at a time. They would always check in at the sheriff's office when they hit town, and Tyler would typically drive out from time to time just to make sure they were okay. See, on that day that he'd taken me out there, he'd been out to check on the family that morning, and they weren't there. And that's when he discovered the weird tracks and the damage to the cabin. The scariest thing of all, the family left lights on and the radio playing when they left to deter burglaries. Whatever the thing was, it thought there were people inside. Later on, Tyler told me that he'd lifted samples of some kind of hair from some of the splintered wood of the door. The DNA hair samples came back and it was determined to be canine. Nothing else was said about the sample, and he wasn't able to get any information whatsoever about the blood and saliva. Something was really wrong when an experienced deputy sheriff got stonewalled on the results of forensic analysis. It meant that somebody was going to a lot of trouble to make sure that no definitive information about this thing got out. Someone, somewhere knew what was going on. They knew that this creature was real and extremely dangerous, and they weren't talking. It was a cover-up, plain and simple.